I sat alone in that hard plastic chair in the public library, my hands trembling. It wasn't the cold, it was pure embarrassment. On the screen in front of me, a blue box blinked, asking for my password, and I couldn't remember if I had just typed it in or if I still needed to. Around me, teenagers typed with a speed that seemed supernatural, their fingers dancing across the keyboards like pianists. I looked at my own hands, wrinkled, slow, insecure, and felt like I didn't belong in that world. The clerk, a young man of no more than 25, sighed for the third time as I approached the counter. He didn't say anything, but the sigh said it all. That thin sound of impatience pierced my chest like a needle. I just wanted to attach a photo of my granddaughter to the email. A photo. Something that should have been simple. But for me, it was like trying to read an alien language. The young man clicked a few buttons, too fast for me to follow, and the photo appeared. He smiled. Not a kind smile, but the kind of smile adults give children when they find something cute and pathetic at the same time. I thanked him quietly and went back to my seat. But when I looked around, I realized that some people had observed the scene, and in their eyes, I saw pity. Not curiosity, not interest, pity. 2 years had passed since my husband died. 2 years since the house became too big and too quiet. And now, at 68, I was discovering that the world hadn't just become smaller without him. The world had changed completely. Everything was digital. Everything was fast. Everything required passwords, clicks, confirmations, codes. I felt like someone who woke up after a long nap and discovered that everyone spoke a new language. My children tried to help, but always in a hurry. Mom, just click here. Mom, I already explained this to you last week. And I pretended to understand because I didn't want to be a burden. But the truth is, I didn't understand anything. And worse, I was beginning to believe that I never would. That night, sitting in the empty room of my house, I looked at the old computer my son had given me. It was there, in the corner of the table, staring at me like a strange creature. I thought about giving up. I thought about accepting that some people are simply born at the wrong time and that I was one of them. But then something inside me snapped. It wasn't hope. It wasn't courage. It was anger. Silent anger. The kind that burns slowly. Anger at having been invisible my whole life. As a wife, as a mother, as a woman, and now being invisible in this new world too. Anger at having allowed other people to decide what I was capable of doing. That night, something broke inside me. And it wasn't despair. It was something much more dangerous. It was the refusal to continue being ignored. Have you ever felt that? That moment when you realize that you either change or disappear forever? Leave a comment below if you've ever experienced something similar, because what happened after that changed everything. The next day, I bought a notebook. Not a pretty one of those hardcover notebooks with flowers or motivational quotes. It was a cheap notebook with a thin spiral binding and a faded blue cover. It cost less than $3. If you're wondering what a 68-year-old woman who barely knew how to use a computer would do with a cheap notebook and a silent rage, then you need to stay until the end of this story. Because what happened in the following months wasn't just impressive, it was unbelievable. But before continuing, if you've ever felt invisible in your life, leave a like below and subscribe to the channel, because I tell stories of people the world underestimated and who proved them all wrong. Now come with me, because what she discovered on her own during those sleepless nights changed everything. And at that moment, holding that simple object in my hands, I felt as if I were holding a secret weapon, because I had understood something important. If the digital world didn't speak my language, I needed to create a dictionary. I started writing everything down. Absolutely everything. On the first page, I wrote in shaky handwriting, Ctrl+C means copy. On the second, dragging is holding down the mouse button and moving. It seemed ridiculous. It seemed like something a child would do learning the alphabet. But each entry was a small victory against the feeling of being lost. I spent hours at that computer, alone, testing things. I clicked buttons just to see what would happen. I opened and closed programs. I made mistakes, noted the error, and tried again. My fingers ached, my eyes burned, but every time I managed to get something to work, even if it was just opening a folder or saving a file, I felt a strange spark in my chest. It wasn't pride yet. It was something smaller, more fragile. It was the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as incapable as everyone thought. My children came to visit me one Sunday afternoon. My oldest son saw the notebook open on the table and picked it up. He flipped through the pages, reading my childish notes, and began to laugh. It wasn't a malicious laugh, but the kind of laugh you get when you find something cute, almost adorable. "Mom, nobody learns like that," he said, still smiling. "There are tutorials, videos, online courses. You don't need to write these things down like it's the 1980s. My daughter-in-law agreed, nodding with that condescending, tender expression. "It's very sweet that you're trying, but it must be so tiring. Why don't you ask us for help when you need it?" I smiled. I didn't answer. I just gently took the notebook back and put it in the drawer. But that night, when they left and the house was mine again, I opened the notebook again, and I kept writing, because they didn't understand. It wasn't about the easiest way to learn. It was about proving to myself that I could do it. It was about not needing to ask for help. It was about no longer being that woman who sighed with relief when someone else solved things for her. I wanted to be the woman who solved things on her own. Weeks turned into months. 3 whole months of sleepless nights, cold coffee left on the table, red eyes and a sore back. I watched YouTube videos in slow motion, pausing every 10 seconds to take notes. I read forums where people asked questions I also had, and little by little, the notebook filled up, full of answers, full of little secrets that the digital world hid from those afraid to ask. And then, something changed. I stopped asking for help. I simply stopped. My children didn't notice immediately, but when they did, their reaction was strange. It was as if I had broken an invisible rule, as if the role of mother depended on me needing them. And it was precisely in that new silence, in that space where I no longer needed anyone, that the discovery happened. The one that would change everything. I was browsing a gardening forum. It sounds silly, I know, but gardening has always been my quiet passion. When my husband was alive, I spent hours tending to the rose bushes in the backyard, talking to the plants as if they could hear me. After he passed away, the garden died with him. I no longer had the strength to care for anything. But that day, sitting in front of the computer, I wanted to feel that connection again, even if it was just reading about flowers on a cold screen. That's when I saw a comment that made me stop. A woman, 72 years old, wrote, "I have 200 recipes from my grandmother written in old notebooks. I wanted to digitize them, but all the apps are too complicated. It seems like they were made for people who already know everything." I kept scrolling. Another person commented, "My granddaughter gave me a tablet as a gift, but I can't organize anything on it. She tries to teach me, but she speaks so fast that I get lost. Sometimes I think she gets annoyed with me." Further down, a 69-year-old man wrote, "I wanted to preserve my family's stories before I forget, but I don't know where to start. Everything seems geared towards young people." I read those comments 3, 4, 5 times, and with each reading, something inside me ignited. It wasn't just that woman. It wasn't just that man. There were many of us, a whole army of invisible people, trying to exist in a world that no longer expected us. I started searching. I spent hours, days, scouring forums, groups, discussion pages, and the more I read, the clearer it became. There was a shared pain, a gigantic void that no one was filling. People my age or older wanted technology, but they wanted something that spoke our language, something that wouldn't make us feel stupid, something that understood that our fingers are slower, that our patience for mistakes is less, that our fear of breaking something is real. And nothing like that existed. Nothing. I sat in the kitchen chair that night with the blue notebook open in front of me and wrote a question at the top of the page. What if I did? I stared at those 4 words as if they were an absurd sentence. Me, who 3 months ago didn't know how to attach a photo. Me, who needed to write down the meaning of drag. Me, who had been ridiculed by my own son. The idea was insane. It was impossible. But the more I thought about it, the more it grew inside me, like a stubborn plant sprouting in concrete. I didn't tell anyone, not my children, not my friends from the church choir, not the neighbor who always asked how I was doing, because I knew what would happen. They would say it was wonderful that I had a new hobby, They would smile with that false affection given to someone doing something naive. And I didn't want to be naive. I wanted to be serious. So I kept the secret like someone guarding a stolen jewel. I started studying seriously. Programming, design, user experience, words I had never heard before. I opened YouTube tutorials on how to create apps. I watched videos of Indians speaking English with a heavy accent, pausing after each sentence to understand. I wrote everything down. I tested everything. I failed at everything, but I didn't stop. Because for the first time in decades, I felt I had a purpose. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about fame. It was about creating something that would say to all those invisible people, I am also like you, and we deserve to exist here. And then, 6 months later, late at night, with burning eyes and trembling fingers, I finally saw something on the screen that worked. Something imperfect, full of flaws, but it worked. And that's when I made the mistake of showing it to someone. I chose my son, the engineer, the one who always seemed to understand technology, who worked with computers, who spoke technical terms at dinner as if they were common words. I thought he, of all people, would understand. I called him on a Saturday morning and asked him to come for lunch. I made his favorite dish, that risotto I always made when he was a child. He came with his wife. We talked about trivial things while we ate. And when we finished, I took a deep breath and said, I made something. I want to show you. I led him to the computer. I opened the prototype of the application. My hands were sweating. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I explained carefully. It was an application for older people to organize their memories, recipes, family stories. Everything simple, large buttons, clear instructions, no complicated terms, no hidden menus, no feeling of being lost. I spoke quickly, stumbling over my words, trying to sound enthusiastic. But when I finished, the silence that settled in the room was as heavy as lead. My son stared at the screen for exactly 7 seconds. I counted. Then he turned to me and said, in that voice adults use to correct children without sounding rude, Mom, this already exists. There are about 10 apps that do exactly that. And to be honest, nobody's going to use them. The market is already saturated. My daughter-in-law laughed. It wasn't a malicious laugh, I know that. It was worse. It was the laugh of someone who finds something adorable and pathetic at the same time. It's so sweet that you tried, she said, touching my shoulder with feigned gentleness. Seriously, it's amazing that you learned so much. But maybe it's time to relax a little, don't you think? You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Cute. That word pierced my chest like a shard of glass. I didn't want to be cute. I wanted to be taken seriously. I wanted someone to look at what I'd done and say, that's impressive. But instead, I received pats on the back and pitying smiles. They finished their coffee, thanked me for lunch, and left. I was left alone in the room, staring at the computer screen. The application was still open. Those 6 months of sleepless nights, cold coffee, backaches, tears of frustration, all summed up in one word, cute. That night, I sat down at the computer at 2 a.m. The house was in absolute silence. I placed the mouse over the folder where the entire project was. One click, and everything would disappear. It would be easy. It would be the end of that crazy idea. I could go back to being who I always was, the mother who needed help, the widow who spent her days alone, the invisible woman that nobody took seriously. The mouse remained still there, trembling along with my hand. And then, something happened. I remembered the pitying look from the boy in the library. I remembered the comments from those invisible people in the forums. I remembered my daughter-in-law's laughter. And above all, I remembered one thing. 3 months ago, my son had also said that I would never learn to use a computer. I took the mouse out of the folder. I closed the file. I opened a new one. And I started rewriting everything from scratch. It wasn't going to be cute. It was going to be perfect. It was going to be something that not even my son, with all his technical arrogance, could ignore. I spent the next few weeks redesigning every detail. I tested it with real people in anonymous forums, asking for honest feedback. I changed colors, simplified it even further, added features that I myself would have liked to have. I worked as if I were possessed, because now it wasn't just about helping invisible people. It was about proving that I wasn't one of them. And when I finally finished, I looked at that screen and felt something new. It wasn't hope. It was pure, hard, relentless determination, because I had learned something important. The world only takes you seriously when you refuse to disappear. But what I didn't know was that the next decision I would make wouldn't involve my family. I published the app on a Tuesday night. I chose a small, discreet forum where retirees shared tech tips. I didn't use my real name. I didn't include a photo. I just wrote, "I created this for people like me. It's free. I hope it helps." And I pressed enter. The feeling was strange, like releasing a balloon into the sky and hoping that someone, somewhere, will see it and care. I turned off the computer and went to sleep, but I couldn't close my eyes. I stared at the dark ceiling, wondering if anyone would actually download it, if anyone would understand, if I hadn't just wasted 10 months of my life building something that would die in silence. On the first day, nothing. 0 downloads. I checked my phone every 10 minutes, like a teenager waiting for a message from a crush. My stomach churned every time the screen showed that cruel 0. The second day, the same thing. I started to convince myself that my son was right, that the idea was naive, that I should have accepted the word cute and moved on. But on the third day, when I opened the control panel in the morning, I almost dropped my phone. 47 downloads. 47 people had downloaded my app overnight. My heart raced. Had there been some kind of error? I refreshed the page 3 times just to be sure. On the 4th day, 320 downloads. On the 5th, 2,000. And then the messages started arriving. The first said, "Finally something I can understand without having to ask my daughter for help. Thank you." The second, "Whoever made this really knows us." The third, "I'm crying." I spent the whole morning organizing my mother's recipes. She passed away 3 years ago, and I never knew how to keep them properly. Now everything is saved. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I read each message sitting at the kitchen table, my hands trembling so much I could barely hold my phone. They weren't technical compliments. They weren't cold analyses. They were pure relief, raw gratitude. People telling me they had felt seen for the first time in years. I spent the whole week reading those comments. Some people told entire stories. A 74-year-old man said he had kept letters from his deceased wife and finally managed to digitize them. A 66-year-old woman wrote that her granddaughter was impressed to see her grandmother using technology on her own. Another commented that for the first time he didn't feel stupid using an app. Every word entered me like light shining through a dusty window. I had hit the nail on the head. I had found them, and they had found me. But then, in the second week, I received a different email. The sender wasn't an ordinary user. It was a company, a technology company I knew by name. The subject line simply read, "Acquisition Proposal." I thought it was spam. I almost deleted it. These scams are everywhere, right? But something made me click, and when I opened it, I saw a formal but polite text saying they had noticed the app's growth and would like to discuss a possible purchase. At the end of the email, there was a number, a value. I read it once. I didn't believe it. I read it again. My eyes must have been tired. I read it a third time, this time aloud, counting the zeros one by one. $6 million. I dropped my phone on the table as if it had burned me. I took a deep breath. I walked to the sink, drank a glass of water, and came back. The email was still there. The number was still there. 6 million. For the first time in months, I called my son without thinking twice. He answered on the third ring with that casual voice of someone who doesn't expect anything important. "Hi, Mom. How are you?" I tried to speak, but my voice came out shaky. "I need you to see something. Now." There was a pause. Did something happen? I didn't know what to say, so I just whispered, "Yes, something happened." My son arrived 20 minutes later. He must have broken all the speed limits. He came through the door with a worried look on his face, as if he expected to find me collapsed on the floor or something worse. "Mom, what happened? Are you okay?" I was sitting at the kitchen table, my phone in front of me, my hands still trembling. I just pointed to the screen. "Read this." He picked up the phone, frowning, and began to read. I saw his eyes move across the screen, slowly at first, then faster, and then he stopped. Completely stopped. He was silent for 47 seconds. I know because I counted each one, hearing only the ticking of the clock on the wall and his breathing, becoming increasingly shallow. Finally, he looked up at me. He didn't say anything. He just stared, as if he were seeing a stranger, as if the woman sitting in front of him wasn't the same one he'd called cute, the one he'd ridiculed, the one he was sure would never understand anything about technology. "Mom," he whispered. His voice cracked. "What did you do?" I didn't know how to answer, because I wasn't even sure what had happened myself. I just shrugged and said, with a calmness I didn't even know I possessed, "I did what you said was impossible." He read the email again, this time aloud, as if he needed to hear it to believe it. When he finished, he sat in the chair next to me and stared blankly into space. His wife arrived soon after, summoned by him. She read the email, covered her mouth with her hands, and looked at me with those wide eyes of genuine shock. "Is this real? Is this true?" I just nodded. And then she did something that surprised me. She started to cry. Not from sadness, from something that seemed like shame mixed with admiration. "I underestimated you," she said. Her voice choked with emotion. "We underestimated you. I'm sorry, but I couldn't feel victory. Not in the way I imagined I would. Because looking at my son's face, I saw something that hurt me more than any laughter or condescending word. I saw that he no longer knew who I was, and worse, I realized that perhaps he never would. During all those years of being a mother, being a wife, being the woman who needed help, I had become invisible even to the people I loved most. And now, suddenly, I was too visible, and that scared them. We spent hours talking that afternoon. My son asked 1,000 questions. How did I learn? When did I start? Why didn't I tell him? How long did it take? Each answer I gave seemed to deepen the chasm between us. In the following days, the company contacted me again. They wanted to schedule a meeting. They wanted to meet the creator. They wanted to discuss terms. I said yes, but only if my son could come with me. Not because I needed him, but because, in some twisted way, I wanted him to see it. I wanted him to witness the moment when his mother, the woman he thought would never understand technology, sat at a table with executives and spoke as an equal. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and when I hung up the phone, I felt a chill down my spine, because I knew that accepting that money meant more than just selling an app. It meant publicly admitting who I had become. And I didn't know if I was ready for the whole world to see me that way. What if your biggest fear wasn't failure, but discovering that you were always capable, and wasted so much time believing otherwise? Comment below. When was the last time someone made you doubt yourself, and what would you do today if you could go back to that moment? The meeting was in a glass building downtown, one of those that reflect the sky and seem endless. I walked in with my son. Beside me, wearing my best dress, the same one I wore to my niece's wedding 3 years ago. I felt like all eyes in the elevator were on me, assessing, judging. An old woman in a place full of young people in jeans and expensive sneakers. My son squeezed my hand in the hallway and whispered, "You look amazing, Mom. Just be yourself." But I wasn't sure who myself was at that moment. The woman who wrote down instructions in a cheap notebook, or the woman who had created something worth millions? We entered a huge meeting room with a long, dark wood table and leather chairs. 4 people were waiting for us. 2 men, 2 women, all impeccably dressed. They stood and smiled, that kind of professional smile that seems rehearsed. We shook hands, we sat down, and then the interrogation disguised as a friendly conversation began. They asked questions about the app, about its growth, about my vision. I answered calmly, using the terms I had learned on my own, explaining each design decision, each feature. My son sat silently beside me, just observing, and I knew what he was thinking. Who is this woman? Then, in the middle of the conversation, the older man, gray hair, navy blue suit, stopped writing in his notepad and looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. "May I ask a personal question?" I nodded, though my stomach clenched. He exchanged a quick glance with his colleagues and said, almost hesitantly, "When we received the initial report on the application, we assumed the creator would be young, probably someone with a tech background. But we discovered you're 72 years old. And, honestly, that's extraordinary. How did you learn all this?" The room fell silent. I felt all eyes on me, and for the first time, I realized the true weight of that question. It wasn't technical curiosity. It was astonishment. It was the raw, naked surprise of discovering that someone like me, old, without a degree, invisible, had done that, and something inside me began to boil. Because in that, "How did you learn?" I heard what they really meant. How did you, being who you are, manage to do that? I took a deep breath. I looked at each of them, and I said, in a firmer voice than I expected, "I learned the same way anyone learns, studying, trying, failing, starting over. Age doesn't steal the ability to think. It only steals the patience of others." The silence that followed was different, awkward. One of the men cleared his throat. The younger woman smiled, but it was an uncomfortable smile. My son squeezed my hand under the table, a gesture of support, but also of warning. I had gone too far. I had sounded bitter. But it wasn't bitterness. It was exhaustion. Exhaustion of being treated as an anomaly, as if my existence in the digital world were a miracle worthy of a headline. Elderly woman creates app. Unbelievable. I didn't want to be an inspiration. I didn't want my story to be told as an exception. I just wanted to exist, like anyone else who creates something, without my age being the most interesting detail about me. They continued the meeting, discussing contractual terms, timelines, and values, but my mind was stuck on that question, because it revealed something I already knew, but didn't want to admit. To the rest of the world, I would always be the old woman who learned to program. Not the programmer, not the entrepreneur, the old woman. And that word carried pity, surprise, condescension, everything but genuine respect. When we left the building, my son was strangely quiet. We got in the car, and he drove in silence for 10 minutes before finally saying, "You put them in their place." But what he didn't understand was that I didn't want to replace anyone. I just wanted a place. I spent the following week in a sort of limbo. The company had sent the contracts, papers and more papers, legal terms I barely understood. I hired a lawyer, a woman in her 40s, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, who looked at me with a strange mixture of respect and curiosity. She explained each clause patiently, but I knew she was also wondering, how did this woman get here? During one of the meetings, she paused, took off her glasses and said, "You know this is going to be news, right? 72-year-old woman sells app for $6 million. The media will love this story." My stomach churned. What if I don't want it to be news? She smiled, but it was a sad, almost maternal smile. "Then you would need to remain anonymous. And honestly, I don't know if that's possible. They'll want to put you in the spotlight. You would be the face of the campaign, the inspiration. You understand, right? Inspiration. That word again. As if my whole life had been a motivational story waiting to be told. But it wasn't. It was pain. It was loneliness. It was anger. It was years of accumulated invisibility exploding in 10 months of insane work. And now they wanted to turn all of that into a pretty story of overcoming adversity to be shared on social media. I went home and sat in the same place where it all began, the kitchen table with the blue notebook beside me. I flipped through the pages. Ctrl plus C means copy. Dragging is holding down the mouse button and moving. I smiled. It seemed so distant, as if someone else had written it. But it was me. The same woman who today understood APIs, user experience, scalability. I had changed, but the world still saw me the same way, as an anomaly worthy of pity and applause. And that ate me up inside, because I didn't want to be special. I wanted to be normal. I wanted my age to be irrelevant. I called the lawyer that night. My voice came out firm, decisive. "I accept the deal, but on one condition." She picked up a pen. "What?" I took a deep breath. "The app needs to remain free for people over 60. Forever. That's non-negotiable." There was a long pause on the other end. That could complicate the negotiation. They'll want to monetize it. I knew. But I also knew that if I sold my creation just for the money, I would be betraying all those people who wrote to me saying they finally felt seen. So they decide. Either they accept my condition, or there's no deal. The lawyer took my request to the company. 2 days later, I received a response. They accepted. With reservations, with adjusted contracts, with complicated clauses. But they accepted. And when I read that email, I felt something I didn't expect. It wasn't relief. It was weight. Because now, I had to decide the hardest part. Reveal who I was or disappear into anonymity. The lawyer was right. They wanted my face. They wanted my story. They wanted to turn me into a symbol. And for 72 years, I had been invisible. Nobody asked me what I thought. Nobody cared about my opinions. I was just the mother, the wife, the kind neighbor. But now, for the first time, I mattered. And that terrified me more than any poverty. Because being seen meant being judged. It meant my mistakes would be public. That my age would be dissected in cruel comments on the internet. That I would become that woman. The old woman who became a meme, who became a joke, who became cheap inspiration. I spent sleepless nights thinking about it. I looked in the mirror and saw an old woman with deep wrinkles, stained hands, white hair. Did I want the whole world to see that? Or had I forgotten what it was like to exist in the spotlight after so long being invisible? The decision I would make wouldn't be about money. It would be about identity, about choosing who I would be from then on. I signed the papers on a Thursday morning. The lawyer was there, my son too. The room was small, windowless, smelling of stale coffee and paper. My hand trembled as I held the pen. It wasn't fear of the contract. It was fear of what would come after. Because once that signature dried, everything would change. And there was no going back. I signed my full name, the name I've carried for 72 years, but which few know outside my family. And when I lifted the pen from the paper, I felt as if I had closed one door and opened another. But I didn't know what was on the other side. The announcement was made 3 days later. The company published an official statement, and as the lawyer had predicted, my age became headline news. 72-year-old woman creates app and sells it for millions. Retired woman becomes a tech entrepreneur. It's never too late to start. The inspiring story of my name was everywhere. My face, that photo they took at the meeting, where I looked serious, almost suspicious, was plastered across news websites, and with the headlines came the comments. Hundreds, thousands. Some said I was an inspiration. Others said the story was fake, that someone had done it for me. Some were cruel. At 72, she looks 90. I bet her son did it all. Old woman wanting attention. I closed the computer. I didn't want to read anymore, but it had already sunk in. I was no longer invisible, and I discovered that being seen hurts in ways I never imagined. My children called. My granddaughter texted, "Grandma, you're famous." My friends from the choir congratulated me with that exaggerated enthusiasm that seems fake. Everyone wanted to know how I felt, how I had done it, if I was happy. But nobody asked the only thing that mattered, who I had become in the process. Because the truth is, I didn't know anymore. The woman who entered that library ashamed no longer exists. But the woman who signed million-dollar contracts didn't seem real either. I had arranged a lunch with my family. Everyone came, children, daughters-in-law, grandchildren. The table was crowded, noisy, and warm. But when I entered the room, the silence fell like a heavy curtain. They looked at me differently. With respect, yes, but also with distance. As if I had crossed an invisible line and was now on the other side, unreachable. My eldest son raised a glass and made a toast. To my mother, who proved us wrong. Everyone repeated it. They clapped. They smiled. But I saw something in his eyes that broke me. Guilt. Guilt for having mocked. Guilt for having underestimated. Guilt for having been part of the invisibility that pushed me to that place. I could have screamed. I could have rubbed every laugh, every condescending word, every pitying look in their faces. But I didn't. I just smiled. A small, restrained smile that carried decades of unspoken things. And in that moment, I realized something powerful. I didn't need to scream to be heard. My silence was louder than any word, because now, for the first time, they were paying attention. And that, in some twisted way, was my revenge. Not a noisy, angry revenge, but a gentle revenge. Silent, irrefutable. When lunch was over and everyone had left, my son stayed behind. He helped me wash the dishes, silently. And then, with his hands still wet, he stopped and said, without looking at me, "I'm sorry, Mom, for not believing in you, for laughing, for thinking you weren't capable." I stopped washing the plate I was holding. I looked at him, and for the first time in months, I felt something other than anger or sadness. I felt compassion, because he, like so many others, had been taught to underestimate people like me. And now he was learning, in the most painful way, that he was wrong. But what nobody knew, not my son, not the media, not the company executives, was what I planned to do with that. Money. What if forgiveness wasn't about forgetting the pain, but about choosing not to let it define you? Comment below. What's the hardest thing you've ever had to forgive and managed to move on from? I didn't buy a mansion. I didn't travel to Europe. I didn't buy imported cars or designer clothes. My children were confused when they realized my life remained exactly the same. Same house, same routine, same simplicity. Mom, aren't you going to do anything with the money? My youngest son asked, almost worried, as if something were wrong with me. I just smiled and said, I'm already doing something, but I didn't explain. Because what I was building wasn't for them. It was for all the women who, like me, have been forgotten by the world. I created a fund, silent, discreet, without spotlights, without signs bearing my name. Scholarships in technology for women over 50 who wanted to start over. Women who had been mothers, wives, caregivers, and who now, with their children grown, and time finally their own, wanted to learn something new. But they had no money. They had no support. They had no one who believed in them. I wanted to be that person for them. I wanted at least one woman, somewhere, not to have to go through what I went through, not to have to prove anything alone, not to have to carry the weight of others' doubt while building her dreams. The first applicant I received was a 57-year-old woman, divorced, 2 adult children. She had worked as a secretary her whole life and now wanted to learn programming. Her letter was simple, almost timid. I always thought it was too late, but when I read about you, I thought, if she could do it at 68, maybe I can do it at 57. I read that letter 5 times, and I cried, because she was me. She was all of us, an army of invisible women who just needed someone to say, you can do it. I approved her scholarship that same day, and in the following months, I approved dozens of others. Women of 60, 65, 70 years old, each with a different story, but all with the same pain, the feeling of having been left behind. When the media found out about the fund, they wanted to interview me. They wanted to film it. They wanted to turn it into another inspiring story. I refused. I said I preferred the focus to be on the women who were being helped, not on me. But one journalist insisted. He found me leaving the supermarket, recorder in hand, and asked, why did you do this? Why didn't you use the money for yourself? I stopped. I looked at him, and I told him the only truth that mattered. Because I didn't want to be special. I wanted to prove that it was never about being young. It was about being underestimated. And if I can change that for even one woman, then it was worth every sleepless night. Today the app has thousands of users, people from all over the world. But few know my name, and I prefer it that way, because the true revolution isn't about being seen. It's about making others believe that they too can be invisible and still be unforgettable. I still use the old notebook, that same one with the faded blue cover, with the childhood notes on the first pages. I still write things down, new ideas, new learnings, because I discovered something important. The end of one journey is only the beginning of another, and I haven't finished. Not at all. My son asked me the other day, Mom, are you going to do something else? Another app? I smiled. I didn't answer. I just said, maybe. But the truth is, I've already started. Because I've learned that the greatest power isn't in winning once, it's in continuing to start, in never letting anyone tell you that you're finished, in being living proof that age is just a number when you refuse to believe the limitations imposed on you. And if there's one thing 72 years have taught me, it's that the world only stops underestimating you when you stop asking permission to exist. So yes, I'm planning something new, but this time, I'm not going to tell anyone. I'll let them find out when it's ready, because the best revenge isn't shouting, it's simply continuing, and I intend to continue until my last breath. If you've made it this far, to this last line of the story, it's because something inside you recognized this pain, or this longing, or this silent anger at having been underestimated so many times you've lost count. And I want you to know one thing. You're not alone in this. I tell these stories precisely for this reason, so that you feel there's someone on the other side who understands exactly what you're going through. So if this video touched you in any way, if it made you feel less invisible, leave a like below. It's not about numbers. It's about telling me, I heard you, and that mattered. And if you want to keep hearing stories like this, real stories of people who started over when the world said it was too late, subscribe to the channel, because I'm not here to fill your feed with nonsense. I'm here to remind you that your life still has unwritten chapters, and that it's never, ever too late to start writing them. Leave the phrase, "I can still start over," in the comments. It doesn't matter if you're 30, 50, or 70 years old. Write it down. Because when you write it down, you start to believe it. And believing is the first step to making it happen. And since you've made it this far, there's a video here that perfectly complements this conversation. A story that will show you that starting over doesn't have to be grand. Sometimes it's just a small, quiet decision that changes everything. Click and continue watching. Let's do this together.